So I'm Dr. Tim Janzen. I'm a family practice doctor here in Portland, Oregon. Today's topic will be analysis of two different cases that I've worked on that are somewhat complicated, but focus on the use of autosomal and Y chromosome analysis to draw genealogical conclusions. And I've made the PowerPoint presentation for today's presentation available at the tiny URL that I show on the screen there. That's tinyurl /Py8WFA5C. First case I'm going to talk about today is one that I've been working on over the past 1 to 2 months, and it involves one of my Cox ancestral lines. Basically, this particular ancestral line is one I've worked on actually starting about 2 to 3 years or so ago, and I first hadn't even known I had Cox ancestors in my line, and I've given some presentations at ISOGG for our group in the past about this. But this particular situation is somewhat interesting in that one of my mom's cousins, George Cox, was tested at FTDNA, and he did the big Y test recently. He has only one match there at 111 markers, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Mullen, who is a genetic distance of 6 from George. Mr. Mullen has only tested at 111 markers and hasn't done the big Y up to this point in time. So the big question is really, how are these two gentlemen related? And is their connection back somewhere in England, where George Cox's ancestors were from, or here in the United States? So this presentation will focus on trying to answer that question. And below you can see a screenshot from the comparison at FTDNA between these two gentlemen. So one of the first things I did when I started working on this case was to analyze the Y chromosome data a little bit more carefully and looking at that to see just exactly what this revealed. As you can see at the bottom here, I've included both haplotypes. They both joined the Cox FTDNA project. I've inserted the URL for that here below. Now you can see that Mr. Mullen claims to descend from ethnic Farrar on his FTDNA website, but he actually doesn't have Farrar ancestry, and I will go into that in a little bit more detail in the near future. You can see the Y chromosome, the terminal SNP R-BY32727 on the right lower side there, where George Cox has been tested, but you just see a predicted haplogroup for Mr. Mullen. He has not yet done any SNP testing, so as a result, we don't know exactly what his terminal SNP is. But it'll be, of course, similar to Mr. Cox's because they have a very, very similar STR signature. So the first thing I did basically was I went ahead and ran a tip comparison between Mr. Mullen and George Cox, and they're a genetic distance of 6 at 111 markers. So FTDNA would predict that within the past 12 generations or so, there is about a 95% probability that they share a common paternal ancestry. The next thing I moved to after we did the initial Y chromosome analysis was I went ahead and started to do some autosomal DNA comparison. Mr. Mullen uploaded to JetMatch, and from there, I was able to run the comparisons between all the known descendants of Charles George Cox, born 1726, and Mr. Mullen. So George Cox, who was tested, and my mom are both descendants from Charles George Cox. And I just figured that out maybe 1 to 2 years or so ago. And after I corresponded with Mr. Mullen, he got in touch with his first cousin as well, actually a half first cousin, who also uploaded to JetMatch, and I ran comparisons there. And these comparisons basically suggested that there was no closer than a fourth cousin relationship between Mr. Mullen, his cousin CC, and the Cox family that I come from. So here are the comparisons. When I ran these, I included my mom's immediate relatives as well as some other distant relatives here in the chart below. This is comparison all done at JetMatch, and I typically will include the start and stop positions. I typically use a 5 centimorgan threshold when I run these comparisons. And a point I want to make about this chart is oftentimes I'll also create another column up on the right side here about what the probability of this particular HIR, half identical region, being a false match or a true match. And in this particular case, some of these have a fairly high likelihood of being false matches due to the fact that there's not that many SNPs in the half identical region. And there's one down here that might actually be a truly genealogically significant and true matching segment. And it's got 1,700 SNPs in it. So that makes it more likely that this is a true match and not a false match. The first one that my mom has here is actually already mapped to a different family line. So I know for sure that that HIR, or half identical region, did not come down through the Cox line. I did the same thing for CC. I ran the comparisons there as well at JetMatch for all the various different Cox relatives that are uploaded to JetMatch. And again, we're not seeing any large matching segments at this point. So this is the basis for my conclusion that the genealogical connection is no more than fourth cousins and probably is more likely a fifth to sixth cousin or so relationship, or maybe even more distant than that, between Mr. Mullen and George Cox and the rest of my mom's Cox relatives. So let's take a look at some pedigree charts here. First, I'm going to show the pedigree chart for George Cox, who unfortunately died earlier this year. And you can see his ancestral line goes back to a James Cox up in the right upper corner there. James Cox, born in 1791, goes back to the shared ancestor with my mom, whose name is Charles George Cox, born 1726. He was the immigrant ancestor from England, came over around 1750 to 1755. And then I've worked on the ancestral lines for Charles George Cox here, and I'm summarizing those. It goes back to Christopher Cox, and then we can trace it all the way back into the 1500s to a Robert Cox, who was born about 1538. So that's the ancestry that we have for the Cox family. So now let's take a look at Mr. Mullen's ancestral lines. His father is known to have been Andrew Mullen, who died in 2007 and was born in 1942. His grandfather, however, on the paternal line of descent was not a Mullen. He was actually a Farrar. His name was James Farrar. And he was born in 1920 and died in 1971. And you can see more information on this particular family tree at search in the Family Search family tree. So when I first started looking at this, I was, of course, concentrating on James Farrar's ancestry. And there are many pedigree charts out there at Ancestry.com and elsewhere that basically state that James Farrar's father was a William Robert Farrar, born in 1873. And I've included one of those below. James Farrar's mother was Elizabeth Barnes, born 1888. You can see their Skaggs ancestry, etc. So let's take a look at Robert William Farrar's ancestry a little bit more. His grandfather was Ethic Farrar, who was the paternal ancestor that Mr. Mullen still has over in his tree at FTDNA. And then there's Barnes lines, etc., as we talked here earlier. If we take Ethic Farrar's ancestral line, go back, you see that he goes back to Jonathan Farrar, who was born in 1689. Interestingly enough, they also came from Hingham, Norfolk, England. So as I was looking at this, my initial thought was, how interesting. Robert William Farrar's earliest paternal ancestor, John Farrar, was born in 1808 in Hingham, Norfolk, England, and then immigrated to Massachusetts, whereas George Cox's ancestor, Robert Cox, was born in Hingham in 1697. And his earliest ancestors were going back clear to a John Cox, born in Norfolk. And all these people were from Norfolk, England. I thought, well, this can't be a coincidence. There's got to be a connection here. Well, it wasn't that simple. Mr. Mullen and CC didn't have any autosomal DNA matches who were related to Robert William Farrar, the man who would have been their great-grandfather if James Farrar had been the son of Robert William Farrar. But that simply wasn't the case. There weren't any matches. Something was amiss. And it wasn't because people weren't tested. There were definitely people who were related to Robert William Farrar who would be autosomal matches if they had been related through this Farrar line, but it didn't make any sense. Another complication was the fact that the Y chromosome haplotype of Mr. Mullen doesn't match that of a descendant of John Farrar, who was born in 1608 and is found in the FTDNA Farrar DNA Y chromosome project. I thought initially, well, maybe there's an MPE there on the other Farrar's line. But then when I figured out that the autosomal matches didn't make any sense, then we basically were kind of back to the drawing board here. We didn't know who the father of James Farrar was. So here's John Farrar's descendants Y haplotype and also his haplogroup on the right side here. You can see that he's from haplogroup M253. And if you recall, the Cox line is from haplogroup R1b. So this doesn't make any sense that there's any genetic connection here between John Farrar and Mr. Mullens or the Cox line. So the next thing we did after having this complication was we decided we were going to dive into the autosomal match list for both Mr. Mullen and for CC, who is his half first cousin. And they very graciously were willing to share their match lists with Danny Hall and me. I've been working with Danny for quite a few years. He's a professional researcher in Utah. And so we dove into this in significant detail, starting basically about 2 months or so ago is really when we started working on this particular project. And the first thing we were able to confirm was that James Farrar's mother was truly indeed Elizabeth Barnes, as has been claimed for many years. But the next thing that Danny Hall noted in particular was that there's a strong connection somehow to a Plunkett family, specifically John Plunkett and his wife, Mary Connor, from the early 1800s. Many matches seem to be descended from this particular couple or from their ancestors. And then this led us to look at John Plunkett's daughter, Rebecca Plunkett, who was married to a gentleman by the name of James Howard Cox, who was born in 1851, died in 1926. So he's a potential candidate for somehow being related to James Farrar. Okay, here's the Elizabeth Barnes pedigree chart. You can see that going back with the Barnes and Skaggs. So we confirmed this particular ancestral line by looking at the matches for CC and for Mr. Mullen. And there were plenty of Skaggs matches and Barnes matches. You shared the right amount of DNA to be related through Elizabeth Barnes. So then we started looking again at the Plunkett and Connor pedigree chart. And here's the pedigree chart from Family Search for that particular couple. And then we started looking at the pedigree chart for James Howard Cox. Well, his father was shown as John Howard Cox. Initially, we didn't have a mother for James Howard Cox, but Danny Hall did some more research and found that there was a marriage between John Cox and Mary Swords in 1849 in Marion County, Indiana. And that seemed to match up with information from the 1850 census. As we were kind of pondering this whole situation, we looked at the match list for both Mr. Mullen and for CC, and there weren't very many people who had Cox ancestry in their match lists. However, we did note that some of the matches descended from William Swords and his wife Margaret, and William Swords was the grandfather of Mary Swords, born 1832, who had married John Howard Cox. So this seemed to suggest a connection to John Howard Cox, born 1832. So here's the pedigree chart for William Swords, born 1753, and his wife Margaret. Goes back to a Seward line. This child, Abel, married Margaret Leatherman, and her ancestry isn't currently known. And Mary Swords was the daughter of Abel Swords, shown here. We looked more carefully at the match list for Mr. Mullen and CC, and we found only one DNA match who descended from James Cox. And this particular gentleman, DF, shared only 15 centimorgans with Mr. Mullen. And he's not even a match at all to CC over at Ancestry.com. And they should be third cousins. So we'd expect there to be about a 55 centimorgan match between CC and Mr. Mullen. And in this particular case, there was, at least at Ancestry, no shared DNA. Now, this isn't extremely common, but it's not extremely rare either. We know from previous research that about 10% or so of third cousins don't share any autosomal DNA. And in this particular situation, apparently there just wasn't much DNA that was passed down on this particular Cox line from DF's ancestral line to the Mullen and CC line. So anyway, that was kind of interesting. So less shared DNA than we would expect and very few matches. And as we got into this a little bit more, it became very clear that there were very few living descendants of James Cox, born 1851. And that may be part of the reason why we've only found one person so far who descends from James Cox who has been doing DNA testing. The next thing that Danny Hall discovered was that some of the matches for Mr. Mullen and CC have a connection to the Thomas Cox family, born about 1760 or so, who lived in Greenbrier County in Virginia. So that was an important discovery. Here's an example of some of the work that we did with DF. In his particular situation, we had to figure out his pedigree chart because if you look at this through lines connection, it's all kind of mangled in terms of DF's family tree. As you can see that there's 3 connections here and they're all born within 15 years of each other. And they obviously can't be the correct ancestral line for DF. So we had to sort that out and figure out DF's true family tree, which we did. And here it shows it accurately. It goes back to Dorothy Morton and then back up to his Dorothy Morton's grandmother was Lena Cox, born 1880, who was a daughter of James Howard Cox, born 1851. So that was his true pedigree chart. There's a lot of work like this that has to be done frequently because the fact that people either have no tree at Ancestry.com or they have very primitive or limited trees. You're going to have to trace many, many trees in order to sort some of these kind of things out. The next thing that Danny Hall did was to go through all of the matches for both Mr. Mullen and for CC at Ancestry and try to see who had connections up to the Cox line. So I mentioned earlier, the Thomas Cox line basically has a fair number of significant matches to CC, but when we looked at Mr. Mullen's match list, he had very few other than the DF match that I mentioned earlier. There weren't any other large matches with the Cox family. The CC apparently got more Cox and A passing down through her ancestral line. And you can see there's some pretty significant matches here. At the bottom here are the number of centimorgans that these people share in common with CC. Some of these share as much as 58 centimorgans. Here's a 50 centimorgan match. Here's a 48 centimorgan match. And most of the rest of these are in the 15 to 30 centimorgan range, all coming from different lines of Charles George Cox, born 1726. This is the Thomas Cox, born 1760. So this is the reason why we focused in on Thomas Cox as the probable line, because it seemed like there were more matches with more centimorgans in this particular branch of the Charles Cox family tree who were related. The next problem we ran into is that James Howard Cox, born 1851, we didn't know how he was going to end up being the ancestor for James Farrar. As I mentioned earlier, we only have one match, this DF who is sharing DNA, who descends from James Howard Cox. And so that's not been very helpful so far in terms of the descendancy. So we looked at the children for James Howard Cox, and there are basically 2 likely candidates. One is the son, John, who was born in 1851, and also the son, Emmett, born 1882. And another brother, had moved away, so he wasn't in the same vicinity where James Farrar was born in 1820. John did have some children, but none of those have done a DNA test, and James had no known children. So at this point, we can't really be certain whether it's John or Emmett James who would have been the father of James Farrar. So we're kind of stuck in that regard at this point in time. So the next complication we had to deal with was the fact that we didn't really have any clear documentation as to who the parents of John Howard Cox, born 1822, were. So let's review the genealogical information that we have from John Howard Cox, born 1832. He has a tombstone, and it says that he was born July 11th in 1882, and we have a death date from the tombstone of 1901. He's found in the 1850 census in Marion County, Indiana, and then he moved to Shelby County, Missouri, where he lived basically the rest of his life. The 1880 census says that his parents were born in Virginia, but as you can tell here, the various different censuses say have different states of birth for himself. One says he was born in Ohio, another says he was born in Indiana, another says he was born in Virginia, but there seems to be some consistency that at least his parents were born in Virginia from the various different censuses. These are all kind of clues to John Howard Cox's ancestry. So here's his tombstone from Find a Grave, and here is the 1850 census data for him from Marion County. Notice his first wife there is given as Mary, and she was Mary Swords, as we've discussed earlier in the presentation. One of the next clues on this family that Danny Hall discovered was he found a marriage record for a Lucinda Harford and John Clow in Marion County, Indiana, that looked interesting. And the reason it looked interesting is because John Howard Cox named one of his daughters Lucinda Clow Cox. She was born in 1867. This started to make us hone in on Henry Cox, who was in Marion County, Indiana, who had married Elizabeth Harford, who was the sister of Lucinda Harford. This is starting to get tantalizing here. We have a potential candidate for the parents of John Howard Cox, who prior to the research we did, no one had known who John Howard Cox's parents were. So here's some of this genealogical information. One of the trees at Ancestry.com has Lucinda Suey Clow Cox Taylor and her birth and death date information there, as well as the information taken from the 1920 census, where her name is specifically given as Lucy Clow Taylor. So she had married a William Sylvester Taylor, and that's shown here in this screenshot from the 1920 census. So if we go back and look at this marriage record a little bit more, here's the marriage for Lucinda Harford and John Clow in 1825 in Marion County, Indiana, another version of it at the bottom. And here's the marriage record for Henry Cox and Elizabeth Harford, who got married in 1818 in Gallia County, Ohio. You can see the screenshot of the original record below. So here's some additional information about Henry Cox. Basically, he shows up in Ross County, Ohio in the 1820 census, and it gives his age as being 16 to 25. He has one female at that time in his household who's under 10, and then he's married, which is consistent with what we know about his wife, Elizabeth Harford. It turns out that Henry Cox died in 1829, but his widow is listed in the 1830 census as Elizabeth Cox, and she's in Marion County, Indiana, and her family is shown here. One problem with the 1830 census data, if you will take note, there aren't any males who appear to be sons of Elizabeth Cox listed in the census record, and it's hard to know what that means. It seems to be incorrect. It's possible that maybe one or so of her children was not included in the census for some reason or other, or maybe the census was simply done incorrectly. Here's the probate records for both Henry Cox and for his wife, Elizabeth. Elizabeth ended up dying in 1831, shortly after the 1830 census was taken. So at the top, you can see Henry Cox's probate records from September of 1829. And then at the bottom, you see Elizabeth Cox's probate records from September of 1831. No tombstones or anything else that we've been able to find, or a will for Henry Cox, just the probate records. Where things got interesting was when we were reviewing all the probate records and looking for additional newspaper articles on this family. Danny Hall found this particular probate summary that was basically done 14 years after Elizabeth had died. This was published in the newspapers in Indiana, and it basically goes through and lists probate case regarding partitioning of the real estate, and it nicely names all the children of Henry and Elizabeth Cox, including John Cox, who's the very first one listed at the top here, and then all the other siblings in this particular family, who prior to this time, we hadn't really known who all the siblings were. So this is a very important piece of genealogical data for us. We've now shown that there is a John Cox in the Henry Cox and Elizabeth Cox family, but we didn't have any clear documentation for who Henry Cox's parents were and how he ties into the Thomas Cox family, if he ties into that family. So let's discuss the genealogical data that we have regarding Henry Cox. He married Peggy Price in Greenbrier County, Virginia in 1817. They had apparently a turbulent marriage, had one child together, and then they got divorced. Then Henry married Elizabeth Harford in Gallia County, Ohio in 1818. Peggy later filed for divorce in 1823. And as I mentioned earlier, there's 1820 census data for him in Ross County. Of importance is the fact that David Clow, the father of John Clow, was a close neighbor of Henry Cox in the 1820 census. So that's quite interesting as well. Mentioned earlier that his estate was probated in 1829 in Marion County, Indiana. His widow is in the 1830 census. There is information from the 1880 and 1900 censuses that says that Henry was born in Virginia. So then how can we be certain that Henry Cox was the son of Thomas Cox? Well, we did a little bit more work on this. As you may realize, Cox is a pretty common surname. It's not as common as Smith or Jones, but still pretty common. And there's almost 1,000 people in the Cox FTDNA surname project. So it's a pretty common surname if you get into it. One of the things that we talked about earlier was that there's a genetic connection somehow between Thomas Cox and Mr. Mullen and CC. Well, we haven't found a will for Thomas Cox, born 1760, but there are fortunately tax lists from Greenbrier County, Virginia, that show that there's a Thomas Cox there in 1807. And then Margaret Cox, his widow, is shown there in 1809, 1810, 1817, 1818. Another son, William, is there in 1807 all the way up through 1818. Charles Cox, another son, is shown there just in two tax lists in 1812 and 1814. And there's a Henry Cox who is there for 3 years, 1816 to 1818, and then he disappears from the tax list after that. So it would seem that this Henry Cox is the same one that we've been discussing earlier. Here are the tax lists. Another thing that was interesting was the fact that the date that Henry Cox, Margaret Cox, and William Cox paid their taxes in 1817 was the exact same date, which would suggest they were likely members of the same family. This particular tax list included the date where people paid their taxes. Not all tax lists give the dates, but this particular county included the dates during this particular time frame. And I've included the 1816 tax list as well, which shows William Cox and Henry Cox. So the conclusions that we can draw from this, it would seem that Y chromosome data has confirmed that Mr. Mullen and George Cox descend from the same Cox ancestor on their patrilineal line. We've used autosomal DNA data to help confirm a genealogical connection to the descendants of Thomas Cox, born 1760, who was the son of our common ancestor, Charles George Cox, born 1726. We used genealogical records to help establish a connection that John Howard Cox was a grandson of Thomas Cox, born 1760. And if you're interested in additional details on this, Danny Hall's written a 3-page summary of some of the other interesting genealogical data, which you can download from this particular tiny URL if you have further interest in this case. So here's the final pedigree chart for Andrew Mullen, Mr. Mullen's father, and it shows James Farrar as the father, and then an unknown Mr. Cox here as the grandfather, and then going back to James Howard Cox, and then finally to John Howard Cox, showing the Plunkett ancestry and the Barnes ancestry as well. Here's the John Howard Cox pedigree chart from Family Search, going back from James Howard Cox to John Howard Cox, Henry Cox that we just discussed, and then Thomas Cox, and finally to Charles George Cox in the right upper corner. So there's still some questions that could be reviewed further if we wanted to that haven't really been completely addressed. We still don't know the name of the wife of Charles George Cox, born 1726. I have an inkling that there's somehow a connection to the Ham family based on some of the chromosome mapping I've been doing. And another thing that would really be nice to do would be to see if we can get other matches to Charles George Cox on the Y chromosome to help prove a connection back in England. In spite of the fact that the Cox line has been traced back into the 1500s, we don't have any other Y chromosome matches from England that help confirm the ancestral line back there. It'd certainly be nice to have some of those, at least one of them. And can we basically get a mitochondrial DNA test so that we can get a haplotype for the wife of Charles George Cox? That can sometimes be of help genealogically. And then also, can we get another descendant of John Cox, born 1891, to test to see if John Cox was the father of James Farrar? So these are still things that could be looked at and possibly in the future will be addressed. I'm going to switch gears now and go into another case that I've worked on. This particular case I worked on primarily last year. I haven't done that much work on it this particular year, except for creating this presentation. The work on it started basically about 2 years ago, and I'll go into that in some detail as we discuss this. It started with my mom's cousin, M. McCleary, doing a big Y at Family Tree DNA several years ago, and that led to further discoveries. First of all, I discovered that my mom's cousin, M. McCleary, had 2 matches. One was to another known McCleary descendant, L. McCleary, and then also this man by the name of J.H. It took a while, but we eventually figured out how L. McCleary was related to my McCleary line. That was a significant focus for genealogical research between L. McCleary and another major McCleary researcher, Danny Hall, and myself. Actually, through much of 2020, we were working on that particular McCleary line. However, JH didn't have any known McCleary ancestry. M. McCleary is a genetic distance of 2 from L. McCleary and a genetic distance of 3 from JH. That's at 111 markers. So the obvious question is, how are these people related to each other? And is the genealogical connection here in the United States or back somewhere in Ireland, Scotland, or somewhere else in Great Britain? The initial contact on this particular line came from HH, who is a niece of JH, who contacted me in December of 2019, shortly after I got the Y chromosome results back for M. McCleary. She was basically managing JH's FTDNA account, and I, of course, was managing the account for my McCleary cousin who tested. We also learned that AH had tested her mother and 2 sisters of JH at Ancestry.com. So there were basically 4 siblings who'd been tested, 3 of whom were tested at Ancestry.com, but JH was only tested at FTDNA. He fortunately did Family Finder and able to get all 4 siblings to upload their genetic data to JetMatch so we could run all the comparisons there. The other thing that happened was HH shared the autosomal match list for her mother and one of her mother's sisters, DD, with Danny Hall and me. So we were able to look at the match list. So here's my particular ancestral line, and this would be M. McCleary's ancestral line. My mom descends from Moses McCleary, born 1815, and H. McCleary descends from Moses McCleary as well through one of the sons. And it shows the ancestral line going back to William McCleary here and John McCleary, again, pedigree chart from Family Search. And here's the ancestral line for L. McCleary. He is a grandson of a Laura McCleary, born 1878. And his ancestral line goes back to a Thomas McCleary, who was also son of John McCleary. And this entire section of L. McCleary's tree was something that we worked very hard on in 2020 and hadn't been well known and figured out basically until probably the fall of 2020. And here's known descendants of John McCleary over at Family Search. Various different ancestral lines. Of these, only William McCleary and Thomas are known to have descendants at this time. And here's my particular ancestral line, the William McCleary family. And as you can see, he had a fairly large number of children. Danny Hall and I worked on this, particularly about 4 to 5 years ago, trying to figure this family out. Because when I started work on this, I only knew my ancestry back to William McCleary, born 1771. Here in the middle of the screen. Thomas McCleary family was also difficult to figure out. We're still working on that, but we've found basically about 8 or so children so far, but don't have a wife for either of these families. So Thomas McCleary and William McCleary, their wives are not known. Rebecca might be the name of the wife for William McCleary because Rebecca is commonly found in the descendants of William McCleary, but still no proof of that. No wills for any of these people. So made it challenging. Problem number 1 here. I've included HH's summary of her problem. She emailed me in January of 2020 and said, I have got a feeling we've got a McCleary line, but there may be some infidelity to adoptions or both, and we just don't know where this is. So she worked on this off and on, but she hadn't been able to find a true connection. And she summarized the problem. Basically, she said that her mother's paternal grandfather was William Hellman, born about 1880 or 1881 in Shannon, Carroll County, Illinois. But this was his self-reporting. And she couldn't find any verification of this. Story goes that his parents died when he was young. He was adopted, but mistreated, and he ran away. Basically, HH's grandmother, who was the daughter-in-law of William Hellman, basically thought it could have been Heilmann, and then maybe it was German, but no clear understanding of where the family line came from. And per HH's particular grandmother was a notoriously inaccurate reporter, and thus moving to DNA testing. And she summarized this as, again, her summary back in January of 2020 before we started working on this. She says, I'm still hopeful we can solve this. Well, so was I, very hopeful. And then so she emailed me and said, I really appreciate your help working this. We've been trying to figure it out for 30 years. DNA's got it closer, but we haven't solved it. It's frustrating. Been able to identify cousin's mystery great-grandfather in about an hour using DNA, but my mom's great-grandfather, yet after all this time, still unknown. So again, her summary from January of 2020 that's quoted verbatim for her email. So here's the mystery gentleman, Mr. William Hellman, born 1880, died 1970. A photo of him from HH. Let's dive into his genealogical data. So the first record we have for Mr. Hellman is the entry from the 1900 census in Carroll County, Illinois, where he was a boarder with the Charles Wiesner family and was a farm laborer at that point. So here it says he was born in October of 1880, gives his birthplace as Illinois, and also interestingly says that his mother's birthplace was Pennsylvania, but doesn't give a birthplace for his father. So seems like he didn't know that information or didn't know it very well, which if he was adopted or whatever, would be understandable. So here's the additional information we have on Mr. Hellman. He got married in 1904 to Eva White in Ogle County, Illinois. And there in his marriage record, his parents were named as George Hellman and Helen Smither. Then if we go to the 1910 census, he's still married to Eva, gives his age as 28, and his birthplace as Illinois, as well as that of his parents, is given as Illinois and not Pennsylvania, as mentioned earlier. He remarried after Eva White apparently died, and then he married Elsie Ward in 1918 in Winnebago, Illinois. And that particular marriage record gives the parents as George Hellman and Mary Younger. So we're getting some different information here. Same father, but different mothers are listed in these marriage records. There's a World War I draft registration for him. It says he was born in October of 1880. 1920 census says he was born in Illinois and gives his parents his birthplace as Illinois as well. So here's some detail from the Hellman White marriage record in 1904. Basically, as I mentioned earlier, it says the father is George Hellman and Mary Smither. Here's the actual marriage record. You can see George Hellman there, and it looks like Smither down there as the mother's maiden name. So now let's go to the William Hellman and Elsie Ward marriage record in 1918. This gives the mother's name as Mary Younger and still is giving George Hellman as the father. Here's the original of that particular marriage record. And you can see George Hellman listed there and Mary Younger as the mother. All right, let's keep going with additional information about William Hellman. We're now up to the 1930 census. This shows him as age 49, still in Winnebago, Illinois, and gives his birthplace as Illinois and just says that his parents were born in the United States, but doesn't give any specifics on the state that they were born in. There's a 1936 Social Security application that says he was born in October of 1881 and gives his birthplace as Shannon, Illinois. And this time it names his parents as James Hellman and Grace Younger. So we're not seeing consistency here in terms of what he's reporting. Either his memory is faulty or he's kind of making stuff up as he goes along. We don't really know what was the process for all this. Or maybe his wife was helping fill out the information. We don't really know why the discrepancies, but in any case, there are discrepancies. The 1940 census lists him in Winnebago, Illinois, and gives his age as 48 and birthplaces. Illinois, finally, we have his draft registration for World War II, which again states he was born in Shannon, Illinois, but says he was born in 1881 and not 1880, as some of the earlier records have suggested. Here's his World War I draft registration card. So again, this one says he was born in 1880 and gives the name of his wife, Elsie, as the nearest kin. So there's no close relatives referred to here other than his wife. Here's his Social Security application. Again, William Hellman, born in 1881, again, naming James Hellman and Grace Younger as his parents. Here's his World War II draft registration card. So basically this is giving his age of 60, again, stating that he's born in Shannon, Illinois. Up to this point, William Hellman hasn't been found in the 1880 census. He may well have been born after the census was compiled, so that's not entirely surprising. But if we go and look at the 1880 census for Carroll County, and I did that in some depth, went through entire Shannon Township records. There was 250 families or so in Shannon Township, and I went through them all. I couldn't find any Hellman, or there was a Herman family there, but nothing really looked like it would be a potential candidate for the potential parents for William Hellman. And nobody has been able to find any information about George Hellman, James Hellman, Helen Smither, Grace Younger, or Mary Younger either. It is interesting to note, however, that Hellman is a surname that appears in Pennsylvania in places, particularly Franklin County, which becomes important later in this presentation. So there were only 2 matches to HH's mother, MB, at Ancestry.com, who had Hellman Ancestry. This one, John Hellman, was from Franklin County, Pennsylvania. And then there was another descent from a Harry Hellman, who was from Air, Pennsylvania. So you can see their pedigree charts if you're interested in reviewing that at some point. But that was it for DNA hits pertaining to the Hellman side of things. The other problem that we ran into as we were working on this is that JH and his sisters didn't seem to share very many autosomal DNA segments with any one branch of either my family or L. McCleary's family, the Thomas McCleary line that I had on JetMatch. So, I like to work in JetMatch and run all the comparisons there, but I couldn't find any close matches there, at least as of February 2020 when I was doing work on this particular family. So in any case, I ran the comparisons anyway, and you can kind of see some of the data here. MB does share a fairly large segment on chromosome 6 with my mom and with my mom's mother, who was the person who has the McCleary ancestor. She's actually my mom's mother, Maud Youngman, shares 2 DNA segments with MB, who's the mother of HH. And there's some of these other people, some of these may well be significant. There's a segment here on chromosome 4 that my mom's second cousin, Jane Jean, shares with MB as well. That looks promising. Some of the others, like this one here, may well be a false match. However, there's only 231 SNPs in that particular half identical region, so it may well be incorrect. I also looked at DD, who is one of the sisters in this particular family, looked at her matches at JetMatch, and I came up with similar results here, running the comparisons at JetMatch. There's some shared DNA, but not that much. If you look at the average, there's only 5 centimorgans shared. Basically, at the closest, this would be a 4th cousin, more likely a 5th, 6th, maybe even a 7th cousin based on the amount of shared DNA. And then JH also did Family Finder at FTDNA, and his data was transferred into JetMatch, and I ran comparisons. We're still seeing this segment on chromosome 6 that was passed down through their family as well as into my mom's family. So again, a shared DNA segment that traces back into the 1700s, no doubt. Again, the same relatively little shared DNA, 3.6 centimorgans shared on average with my grandmother, and another match who I didn't list here, only 6.85 shared centimorgans at that generational level. Another sibling here, DS, ran the same type of comparison, basically 5 centimorgans. Some of these may be false matches, so the centimorgan average there at the bottom may be slightly off, a little high. So let's get into the analysis a little bit more now. The first thing that HH had noted when she was working on this some years ago, after she got her mother's match list back and that of some of her sisters, was that there seemed to be a connection to a Swisher family, specifically John Swisher, born 1752, died 1810. Danny and Hall and I, when we started working on this, which was in the fall of 2020, we really hit this pretty hard. We tried to trace all of the known descendants of John Swisher who were showing up as matches to HH's mother and also HH's aunt, DD. And we created some charts and Excel spreadsheets. I'll go into some greater summary of that in the next few slides. Here's the pedigree chart for Henry Swisher, who married a Frances Mariah McCleary. This seemed like an obvious place to kind of start because there's a McCleary connection, and we kind of knew that, although it's not, of course, through the Y chromosome line. This would be a maternal line because obviously Henry Swisher isn't going to pass down the McCleary Y chromosome haplotype to his sons unless, of course, there was an MPE somewhere, which we haven't found up to this point. Here's John Swisher, the grandfather of Henry Swisher. Abraham Swisher's mother is not yet known, so we can't go up her maternal matches and try to find connections there like we might want to, but in any case, this is the information we had when we were starting to work on this. So here's a descendancy chart that Danny Hall created for the Swishers. And there's others that follow here. This shows John Swisher at the top here, who may have married a Springer. And there's at least basically 5 different children that he had here, of which Danny created charts for the Henry Swisher and Frances McCleary line, another chart for the Jacob Swisher line, chart number 2, the Henry Swisher line, chart number 3, and then finally one for John Swisher, chart number 4. I've included 3 of these charts for you as well. Here's chart number 1. So this is particularly of interest because this is the line from Thomas McCleary down to Francis McCleary and Henry Swisher. And this is particularly looking at DD's matches at Ancestry.com. What's interesting here is that there's some fairly significant matches. One has 97 centimorgans, shared DNA. Another has 108 centimorgans of shared DNA. There's 83, 73 here. And there's a couple of matches over here with fairly large amounts of shared DNA, 199 and 160 centimorgans. The problem we ran into, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out the pedigree charts of these 2 matches, but we still never were able to find it. Their genealogical connection into this family is still unknown. Maybe there's an MPE in their line, but we haven't been able to figure that out. In any case, there are a fair number of matches with between 20 and 50 centimorgans that show up here. Here's another chart. This is going through the Jacob Swisher line. Basically, this is chart number 2, and you can see some of these other peripheral branches of the Swisher line all share fairly significant amounts of DNA with DD. Some of these have as much as 45 centimorgans of shared DNA. Here's one with 49 centimorgans. Again, seemingly confirming the Swisher connection. And here's a chart for the Henry line, chart number 3, again showing fair bits of DNA, sometimes as much as 50 to 60 centimorgans here. Here's one with 70 centimorgans of shared DNA on the Swisher line. So what I did was I took Danny Hall's charts and I basically converted them into Excel spreadsheets so I could kind of keep track of the numbers of shared centimorgans, the ancestral lines, the basic matches here, the segments that were being reported, and then the comments about the ancestral line here, which I've included. And this is just the McCleary side of the family, and specifically Francis McCleary's and Henry Swisher's descendants, which there were quite a few, as you can see here. I looked at some of the other ancestral lines as well. So here's the Swisher family. These would not be descendants from Francis McCleary, but from more distant matches, and the amount of shared centimorgans, et cetera, similar to what I did for the descendants of Henry Swisher and also Francis McCleary. The next obvious question that we would have would be, how was Henry Swisher related to William Hellman? So here's the family again that we have. We've got Henry Swisher and Francis McCleary from Family Search, and they have 7 known children. And we're specifically looking for a female here because we're expecting there to be a male connection, but I suppose there could be an MPE with the Y chromosome coming down through the Swisher side, but we were focused at least initially on the female lines and looking at those. So you can see there's 5 daughters in this family. And so we looked at all 5 of those daughters, tried to summarize them here in this particular slide. First, Henrietta was married to Dennis Waltz and had 2 children. They lived in Forreston and Ogle County in 1880. They had a daughter who had married John Horman in 1879, and the daughter could have potentially been a mother to William Hellman as well. Henrietta would have been getting a little bit older to have children in 1880, but she certainly could have been the mother of William Hellman. Then we've also got Mary, born 1846, who married Charles Miller. I haven't found her in the 1880 census, and it's not clear when she married Charles Miller or where she was in 1880. Lucinda was married to John Heiser in 1880. She had 3 children, lived in Brookville, Ogle County, Illinois. A daughter, Sarah, born 1851, was single and living with her parents in McConnellsburg, Fulton County, Pennsylvania. And then finally, the last daughter, Emma, was married to William Miller and had 6 children. They were living in Franklin County, Pennsylvania in 1880. So these are the candidates that we focused in on trying to figure out if one of these daughters could have been the mother for William Hellman. So here's a geography lesson. Basically, up here in the left upper corner, you see Shannon, Illinois. This is where William Hellman reported that he was born. Forreston is where one of the daughters, specifically Henrietta, was living in 1880. And I mentioned also that Lucinda was living in Brookville. So Forreston's over here, and Brookville is down here in the very bottom. And these places aren't very far from each other. They're all within basically a 5-mile radius of each other, Shannon, Forreston, and Brookville. And that's probably not a coincidence. Another connection that we found in 1897 specifically to Shannon, Carroll County, Illinois, was that there was a Richard Switcher who had a connection to some Sowerses who were living in Shannon, Carroll County, Illinois. I haven't been able to make any connection here on this particular situation, but again, shows connections between Pennsylvania and Shannon, Carroll County, Illinois. Another thing to think about is, as we've been talking about these various different families, it should be noted that Sarah Swisher got married to a man by the name of Samuel Unger in 1886. So as we started reviewing this, we thought, well, maybe Younger surname is actually Unger. And possibly this Smither surname that William Hellman gave for his mother could have been a misinterpretation of the surname Swisher. So maybe William Hellman had been adopted out at a young age, knew just a little bit about his family tree and his heritage, and he misinterpreted the surname Unger and Swisher and turned those into Smither and Younger. Hard to know, because we don't know exactly what information William Hellman knew. I did some more DNA analysis on this, and specifically I looked at the grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren and great-great-great-grandchildren of Francis Mariah McCleary, born 1818, trying to see if I could find any of these daughters that had a stronger connection to HH's family. So when I did that, it seemed like there were 2 that seemed to have a little bit more stronger link. Lucinda, born 1848, and Sarah, born 1851. Unfortunately, the number of descendants of these people that are available for comparison is low. There's only about 2 for each, for Lucinda and Sarah, which kind of complicated matters. In any case, Emma seems to be sharing less DNA, and Henrietta's family also seems to be sharing a little less DNA overall. The information suggests a strong connection, but it's not exactly proven which of these daughters might have been the mother for William Hellman. In any case, I've summarized all this, and this spreadsheet is my analysis of the genetic data. Most of this genetic data is from the numbers of matching segments at Ancestry.com, because most of these people have not uploaded to JetMatch and aren't available for comparison elsewhere. That's where I'm going to leave the Swisher situation for right now. Now I'm going to kind of jump over to another cluster of matches that Danny Hall found when he started to look at this. One of the things that he discovered was that there seemed to be a connection to the Wolf surname, Wolf and Hood, and also Hyatt. Here's a chart that shows the descendants from Heinrich Wolf, born 1726, through various different children's lines, John and George Wolf here, born 1768, and John, born 1758. You can see there's quite a few shared matches here, including some sharing as much as 90 centimorgans, and some here with 40, and many with a kind of 20 to 30 centimorgan range matches. So that's certainly of interest. And then the Hyatts also come in. That's another common surname that seems to be showing up here, and is also related to the Wolf family. Seth Hyatt here had a bunch of the descendants, including Shadrach, Seth, etc., Meshach, all who basically have quite a few descendants who are sharing DNA with the family of HH. And the 4 descendants in that family who have been tested. This led us to focus in on this particular wolf family. So here's the wolf family here showing Johannes or John Wolf married to Sarah Hyatt. And there's also a Hood connection here. They had a son, Henry Wolf, born in 1785, who married Rachel Hood. And their daughter, Letitia, born 1817, was married to Abraham Thomas McCleary, born 1813. This would give us a potential link, if this is the paternal line, for why JH got the McCleary Y chromosome, if potentially it came down through Abraham Thomas McCleary. That would explain the Wolf ancestral matches that the family has, the Hood ancestral matches, and also the Hyatt ancestral matches. So here's the Henry Wolf pedigree chart going back, showing the connection to the Hyatt family here, Meshach Hyatt, going back to Seth Hyatt Sr. back up here, Hobbs, where there were more connections to the Hyatt and Wolf family. Haven't found that many matches to the Hood family, Franklin and Hobbs families yet. Here's the same information, a spreadsheet. I basically put it all into a spreadsheet, and you can kind of see it here. And a lot of shared DNA there on the Wolf side of the family. You can see all the various different ancestral lines, and I summarized which lines they came from in this spreadsheet. Here's the same for the Hyatt family, basically summarizing the connections to the Hyatt family. The matches are over here on the left, but I've basically blanked those out for you. Okay, so let's look at this family of Abraham McCleary a little bit more, see if his sons might have been the father for William Hellman. All right, so there's a George, there's Jesse, there's John, and Joseph Rush Benjamin McCleary. Those are the known sons. So here's what we know about those sons. George, born 1839, was married to Eleanor Fritz and had one child. He died in March of 1880, probably in Franklin County, Pennsylvania. But he potentially could have been the father of William Hellman if he had impregnated the lady before he died. Jesse was married to Fanny Kreider, and he had 6 children in 1880, and he lived in Franklin County, Pennsylvania. One son had died in 1878, seemingly ruling him out as the potential father for William Hellman. And then finally, we have Joseph Rush Benjamin McCleary, who was born in 1860 and single at that point. He was living with his parents in the household in McConnellsburg, Fulton County, Pennsylvania. We had some suspicion that Joseph Rush McCleary was the right person. Notice the connection to McConnellsburg, Fulton County, Pennsylvania for Joseph. Joseph is there. Notice that Sarah Swisher is also there in the 1880 census. So they're both in the right place at the right time for Joseph Benjamin to have been the father of this child and for Sarah Swisher to have been the mother. As you probably also have noticed, they're first cousins to each other. So they knew each other, although Joseph Benjamin's a fair bit younger than Sarah, basically about 8 to 9 years younger. So after we had basically figured this out, which occurred basically in late November, early December of 2020, HH reached out to a granddaughter of Joseph Rush McCleary who agreed to test at Ancestry.com. And her results came back this January. And it turns out that she shares 265 centimorgans on average with the 4 grandchildren of William Hellman. And this would be consistent with a 1/2 first cousin once removed relationship to those people. I've summarized their matching centimorgans here from JetMatch. Note, it's a little bit more than we'd expect for this genealogical relationship. 265 centimorgans is a little more than 222 centimorgans, which would be about the amount we would expect. But there's also some background relatedness here, as you may recall, because of the fact that Sarah Swisher and Joseph McCleary were first cousins to each other. That might account for the extra 40 or so additional centimorgans that appear in the average here. It could also just be by chance that there's a little bit more in this situation. Here's a comparison between MB and CG JetMatch, and you can see the matching segment data here, start and stop positions. And then finally, the matches at Ancestry.com for 2 of the siblings, showing the amount of shared centimorgans. This is also interesting. HH sent me a photo that she found for Joseph Rush McCleary, and there's a fairly striking resemblance to William Hellman. I don't know that we can be absolutely certain just based on facial patterns here, but certainly is an interesting similarity between these two photos. Certainly something to ponder. So finally, our conclusions. The Y chromosome data has confirmed that JH, M. McCleary, and L. McCleary all descend from the same McCleary progenitor. We have autosomal DNA data that has helped confirm that William Hellman's mother was a daughter of Henry Swisher and Frances McCleary, and it was likely Sarah Swisher, born 1852, who was William Hellman's mother. The autosomal data, particularly CG's data, has helped confirm that William Hellman's father was Joseph Rush Benjamin McCleary. It seems that William McCleary was likely conceived in Fulton County, Pennsylvania, and then his mother came out to Shannon, Illinois, gave birth there, gave the child up for adoption to a family that we don't really know yet because it's still not clear who raised William Hellman, but this seems to be the logical conclusion. So here's William Hellman's pedigree chart as we've got it figured out now. Parents being Joseph Rush Benjamin McCleary and Alice Swisher. Basically, he is got two McCleary lines, first cousins, had a relationship, and that's how the Y chromosome came down from the McCleary side, and he also has the Swisher autosomal DNA as well. So some of the questions still to be addressed. Who is William Hellman's adoptive parents? Well, we don't really know that yet, and it seems that Sarah probably gave him up for adoption before she married Samuel Unger in 1886. That seems to be likely what happened. We don't know exactly how that all came to be. And then who was the wife of Abraham Swisher? We don't know that information. And then who was also the wife of Thomas McCleary, born 1767? We don't know that either. I'll put in a plug for JetMatch tag groups. I've created a number of these, and I've got 54 in my McCleary tag group right now. I find that really helpful when I run these kind of JetMatch comparisons to use these tag groups. And I'd like to acknowledge all the help that various different people put in on this. Of course, HH has been sending me information for 2 years. Danny Hall worked with me, did a tremendous amount of research both on the Cox and the McCleary cases. And if you want to contact him at some point, you can do so. I've included his email address here. And if you want to download the presentation, feel free to download it at the tiny URL.
Thank you, Tim.
I would just like to say thank you for all the hard work because William Hellman was my grandfather. And it's wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia.